Good evening or good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. So good to see you here. My name is John Goldberg. I'm the interim dean of the Harvard Law School, and I couldn't be happier to be here to celebrate our colleague and friend, Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos, on his appointment as the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law. I'm going to make a few remarks and then turn it over to Professor Stephanopoulos. Before I do so, I want to acknowledge all of his friends, students, colleagues who are here, as well as his family, his spouse, our very own Professor Ruth Greenwood, his father Gregory, Gregory's wife Mirella, his brother Alexander, and his daughter Ileana. Before I tell you about Professor Stephanopoulos, I want to take a moment to describe the professorship and the outstanding law firm that established it. Kirkland and Ellis has long been a supporter of Harvard Law School. Over the past several decades, the firm has provided invaluable funding for spaces. You may notice the name tag around here and there, as well as activities ranging from student organizations and publications to the annual fund and this professorship, the first to be endowed by a law firm in the history of Harvard Law School. In 1987, Kirkland & Ellis committed its own revenues, along with numerous contributions of HLS alumni working at the firm, to establish this professorship. At the time of its establishment, Donald Kemp, LLB, in 1965, explained that the motivation of the gift was to benefit the school's important tradition of outstanding faculty, and that the firm, I think we can safely say, has safely achieved their goal through their generosity. The first shareholder was none other than Professor David Wilkins, the first Kirkland & Ellis professor, and ever since the professorship has been a pillar of our faculty. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Kirkland & Ellis for its generosity. All right, and now to my great colleague. As most of you know, his research and teaching interests include election law, constitutional law, administrative law, legislation, and comparative law. His work is particularly focused on the intersection of democratic theory, empirical political science, and the American electoral system. He is the author of Aligning Election Law, published just this summer by Oxford University Press, and a co-author of Election Law, Cases and Materials. His articles have appeared in all the leading law journals. He is a frequent media commentator and regularly cited as one of our nation's foremost election law experts. He has been involved in several important litigations, including 2 partisan gerrymandering cases decided by the US Supreme Court, and he continues to work on litigation and advocacy as the Director of Strategy for Harvard Law School's Election Law Clinic. Before joining our faculty, Professor Stephanopoulos was a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Prior to that, he was an associate in law at Columbia Law School and an associate in the Washington, D.C. office of Jenner and Block. Before then, he clerked for Judge Raymond C. Fisher of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. A graduate of Yale Law School, Professor Stephanopoulos also holds an MPhil in European Studies from Cambridge University and an AB in Government from Harvard College, graduating summa cum laude. Among many other things, he is a co-founder of PlanScore, a website evaluating past, present, and future districting plans, and TrueViews, a website offering estimates of people's policy preferences at all geographic levels. He is a member of policy reform initiatives, including the Campaign Legal Center's Litigation Strategy Council and the Committee for the Study of Digital Platforms, and that is the abbreviated version of his biography. An endowed professorship is one of the greatest honors that can be bestowed upon a member of our faculty. As his many achievements in both the academy and the legal profession demonstrate, Professor Stephanopoulos could not be a more deserving candidate to hold the Kirkland and Ellis Professorship of Law. Let me conclude on a personal note, 2 personal notes. First, and somewhat frivolously, apologize, I would like to note that as someone with 2 middle names, I rarely experience middle name envy. And yet, I will confess here today that I am deeply jealous that Professor Stephanopoulos' parents bestowed on him the middle name Odysseus. Like I said, a little frivolous, but not entirely. Today, the name Odysseus stands for the idea of an intrepid traveler who overcomes impossible obstacles to reach their destination. A career devoted to legal scholarship is indeed an odyssey of its own, and it's all the more so when one's self-appointed scholarly project is to navigate the shoals of modern American election law. Second, and more seriously, I want to express my gratitude and admiration for Professor Stephanopoulos' commitment to his colleagues and this institution. He is completely devoted to the academic enterprise. He is fully engaged in the intellectual life of the law school. He is wonderfully supportive of his colleagues' and students' work, and in vital and often unseen ways, a wise and effective administrator. In short, and fittingly for a student of democracy, he is a model citizen. I am fortunate, we are all fortunate, to have Professor Stephanopoulos as our colleague, and so I am delighted to have this opportunity to recognize his accomplishments, his talents, and his bright future. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Stephanopoulos, the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law.
Thank you very much, Dean Goldberg, for that generous introduction. I should say on the topic of my middle name, my dad can correct me if I'm wrong, but my parents' thinking was that most Greek heroes and Greek gods are known for their strength, but Odysseus is basically unique in being known for his cleverness, his wiles, his intelligence. As my parents thought that was a better model for a child of theirs to aspire to than, brute hulking strength, I guess. Let me say thank you also to our provost and former dean, John Manning. You convinced me to move to Harvard Law School about 5 years ago, and I'm grateful every day that I made the decision to come here. You told me back then that HLS is a very special place, and I've seen that with my own eyes. I've seen the unparalleled faculty and resources. The students here are also spectacular, and there's a really lovely shared sense of intellectual engagement as we all think and learn about the law together. And so I'm delighted to call HLS my home, and I really can't imagine teaching anywhere else. So speaking of HLS's students, I want to thank you too. I've been lucky enough to teach several hundred HLS students now over the last 4+ years in classes like constitutional law, election law, the Law and Politics workshop, various reading and writing groups, the election law clinic as well. And you really are spectacular. You're eager to learn, you're full of questions and comments, and you make teaching here endlessly interesting and rewarding, so thank you. Let me also say a few words about Kirkland and Ellis, whose generosity is responsible for my chair. I have an interesting personal history with Kirkland. On the one hand, the firm defended the state of North Carolina when I was on the legal team challenging the state's congressional plan as an illegal partisan gerrymander. On the other hand, the firm led a lawsuit that I closely followed and then wrote about against a series of voting restrictions also enacted by North Carolina. And unlike our partisan gerrymandering claim, the firm's lawsuit ultimately succeeded in one of the biggest victories for voters in recent years. And so based on how those two cases turned out, my conclusion is that in the future I should litigate with Kirkland's lawyers, not against them. I want to quickly thank my family as well. The dean mentioned them, but my wife Ruth is here, whom many of you know is the director of the Election Law Clinic. My 5-year-old daughter Ileana is here. My 2-year-old Adrian is not here. He is upstairs eating chicken tenders and fries in the Election Law Clinic office. If he were here, he would likely be running around and saying something like, "That's so silly, Daddy." My father, Greg, is also here, and his wife, Mirella, and my brother, Alec, and I'm very grateful to you for all of your love and support. Okay, let's see if this works. Great. So as you may have noticed, a national election is almost upon us. People around the country are already voting, and election day is just 19 days away. So I thought I'd talk today about America's voters, and in particular, some fundamental ways in which they've been changing over the last few years. These changes have been occurring along financial, educational, racial, and geographic lines. And together, they amount to the most sweeping transformation of the electorate since the civil rights era. As I'll explain, these changes have profound implications for election law and election policy. These implications extend to voting itself and how it's regulated, to minority representation, especially under the Voting Rights Act, and to redistricting, especially the practice of partisan gerrymandering. And these implications, I'll suggest at the end of my talk, are also mostly positive for American democracy. And so at a time when we face significant democratic challenges in the US, we should welcome the emergence of the new electorate. So the first important change in the electorate is financial depolarization, the weakening of income as an electoral cleavage. For decades, wealthier voters were substantially more Republican than poorer voters. But over the last decade or so, this historical pattern has eroded and virtually disappeared. Poorer and richer voters now vote for candidates at about the same rates. In 2020, the richest quintile of voters was actually the most democratic income group in the entire electorate. And this trend of financial depolarization holds across all voters, but it's most pronounced among white voters. This chart here from Sam Zacher plots the difference in Democratic vote share between the lowest and highest income terciles over time. And you can see the partisan gap between the poor and rich was largest in the 1980s and 1990s. It starts falling around 2008, and it actually flips signs in 2020 in that, at least among white voters, the rich were more democratic than the poor. So as income has receded as an electoral cleavage, education has exploded into one of the central axes of modern politics. Historically, there wasn't much of a partisan difference between more and less educated voters. And to the extent there was a difference, more educated voters were somewhat more Republican than less educated voters. But over the last decade or so, this pattern has completely reversed. And today, more educated voters are much more democratic than less educated voters. And this trend is also more dramatic among white voters than among the entire electorate. So in this chart, the yellow line plots the difference in Democratic vote share over time between white voters with at least a college degree and white voters with no more than a high school education. And starting around 2008, you can see this so-called diploma divide rising relentlessly and reaching almost 30 percentage points by 2020. Now, income and education aren't just important socioeconomic variables. They're also highly correlated with all forms of political participation. So richer and more educated people vote, donate to candidates, contact elected officials, canvass, phone bank, you name it, at higher rates than poorer and less educated people. And so the trends I described in the last two slides mean that high propensity voters, who tend to be richer and more educated, are now a mixed or even Democratic leaning group. And low propensity voters, who tend to be poorer and less educated, are now a mixed or even pro-Republican or Republican leaning group. And this is the opposite of the conventional wisdom, which is that Republican voters are more reliable, easier to get to the polls than Democratic voters. You can see the consequences of the party's changing coalitions in these charts made by Spencer Goidel and his co-authors. The charts show you the expected Democratic vote share in hypothetical elections as a function of voter turnout in those elections using data from 2010 to 2020. So in earlier elections in this period, shown here, low turnout benefited Republicans. Democratic vote share was well below 50% when turnout was below 50%. But in more recent elections, especially 2018 and 2020, this pattern flips, and now low turnout actually benefits Democrats because they're now the voters who are more likely to show up when elections are less exciting or voting is less convenient. So what are the implications of the party's changing coalitions for different electoral policies? Well, both voting restrictions and voting expansions mainly affect low propensity voters, voters on the cusp between voting and not voting. High propensity voters are unlikely to be deterred from voting by voting restrictions, and they don't need voting expansions to entice them to vote either. So since low propensity voters are now a slightly Republican-leaning group, most voting restrictions now have neutral or even pro-democratic effects. And by the same token, most voting expansions now have neutral or even pro-Republican effects. As an example, take photo ID requirements for voting. These are probably the most controversial voting restrictions of the last couple decades. This chart from Jeffrey Hardin and Alejandra Campos shows that photo ID laws used to hurt Democrats back when low propensity voters were more Democratic. But in more recent elections, now that low propensity voters are more Republican, photo ID laws either have no partisan impact or even slightly hurt Republicans. So this is all very interesting, you might say, but what does it have to do with law? Well, here's the legal connection. Under the First and 14th Amendments, voting restrictions are subject to what's known as sliding scale scrutiny, based on the severity of the burdens that the policies impose on voting. And so a light burden on voting leads to something like rational basis review. A moderate burden on voting leads to something like intermediate scrutiny, and so on. Now, critically, the analysis of a policy's voting burden under this framework takes into account whether the policy has a disparate partisan impact and how large this partisan disparity is. So all else being equal, a larger partisan disparity indicates a more severe voting burden and leads to more intense judicial scrutiny. And the converse is true as well. A smaller partisan disparity leads to less intense judicial scrutiny because it connotes a less severe voting burden. And that's the situation for most voting restrictions today. They tend to have muted partisan effects, and so they should be subject to less rigorous judicial review, and courts should be more likely to uphold them. And there's some evidence that this is in fact happening. So in the 2016 case of Lee versus Virginia State Board of Elections, for example, the court found that Virginia's photo ID law wouldn't have a disparate partisan impact. And this finding contributed to the court's rejection of the constitutional challenge to the law. And we should expect to see more decisions like Lee as courts respond to today's voting patterns. Today's voting patterns also have major policy implications. So first off, parties shouldn't obsess over voting policies, given that most voting rules now have minimal partisan effects. It simply doesn't move the partisan needle very much, which voting rules are in place. To the extent the parties feel like they need to take positions on voting policies, purely from the perspective of partisan gain, Democrats might weakly favor some voting restrictions, and Republicans might weakly oppose them. And similarly, only taking into account partisan gain, Republicans might weakly favor certain voting expansions, and Democrats might weakly oppose them. Now, obviously, these are exactly the opposite of the party's current and historical positions on voting policies. For decades, voting restrictions have generally been backed by Republicans and resisted by Democrats. And voting expansions have generally been backed by Democrats and resisted by Republicans. For example, the top map here shows you the states that restricted voting in 2023. Almost all of them were red states. And the bottom map shows you the states that expanded voting in 2023, and most of them were blue states. So this is a familiar pattern, but one of my takeaways today is that the pattern no longer makes a lot of sense. It no longer corresponds to how the parties are affected by different voting policies. So today, neither party has a strong electoral incentive to limit voting, and neither party has a good electoral reason to oppose making voting easier. Okay, let me turn next to minority representation, by which I mean the election of minority preferred candidates. Minority representation can arise through Voting Rights Act litigation, and it can also occur without any lawsuits being filed. So the key trend that's relevant here is partial racial depolarization in voting, some lessening of the racial divide in voting. So since roughly the civil rights era, there has been an enormous racial cleavage in American elections, with African American voters and to a lesser degree Hispanic voters supporting Democratic candidates, and a majority of white voters generally supporting Republican candidates. But from 2012 to 2020, the share of black voters voting for the Democratic presidential candidate declined from 97% to 91%. The share of Hispanic voters voting for the Democratic candidate fell from 70% to 62%. Notably, in Florida and Texas, two states with very large Hispanic populations, Hispanic voters were split almost perfectly down the middle in 2020. On the other hand, the share of white voters voting for the Democratic candidate rose modestly from 2012 to 2020, from 42% to 44%. And polls suggest that this depolarizing trend will continue in 2024. The open circles on this chart from Nate Cohn show us what recent polls find about Black, Hispanic, and other minority voters' support for the Democratic presidential candidate. In each case, the open circles are below the full circles, showing us what happened in 2012, 2016, and 2020. So maybe surprisingly, in a couple of weeks, we're likely to have the least racially polarized election in about a generation, since the 1990s. So this decline in racially polarized voting has clear and adverse consequences for plaintiffs bringing racial vote dilution claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. These are claims that some electoral structure, like a district plan, should be invalidated because it dilutes the electoral influence of minority voters. So under the Supreme Court's test for these kinds of claims, minority voters are required to be politically cohesive, and white voters are required to vote as a bloc against the candidates preferred by minority voters. So the data I showed you means that minority political cohesion is now less likely to be present because minority voters are now more divided in their voting patterns. Similarly, white bloc voting is now less likely to be present because more white voters are now voting for minority preferred candidates. And as a result, more racial vote dilution claims should fail due to plaintiffs being unable to satisfy one or more of these two prerequisites for liability. And this is currently happening too. So in the 2023 case of Christian Ministerial Alliance v. Sanders, for example, a court ruled against a challenge to at-large judicial elections in Arkansas because black voters were insufficiently cohesive in that state. In another 2023 case about Boston's own city council districts, the plaintiffs lost because there was insufficient white bloc voting. And there are several more recent defeats for plaintiffs around the country with similar facts and similar rulings. So turning to policy, district designers often want to create minority opportunity districts, even if they're not forced to do so by litigation. And these are districts where minority voters are consistently able to elect their preferred candidates. So the recent decline in racially polarized voting has conflicting effects on the creation of opportunity districts. So on the one hand, it's harder to draw opportunity districts when minority voters are less cohesive because they then contribute fewer votes to electing minority preferred candidates. On the other hand, it's easier to draw opportunity districts when white voters vote less as a bloc because they then contribute more votes to electing minority preferred candidates. And so this suggests that the effects of racially polarized voting won't be uniform nationwide. They'll vary from place to place based on which trend is more important locally, less minority cohesion or less white bloc voting. So Texas's 23rd congressional district is an example of a district that used to be an opportunity district, but then lost this status because Hispanic voters became less cohesive. So in 2016, District 23 voted for Hispanic preferred candidates, but by 2020, it no longer did. Conversely, Georgia's 7th congressional district went through the opposite transformation. It wasn't an opportunity district in 2016, but it turned into one by 2020 as white voters in the Atlanta suburbs became more willing to vote for minority preferred candidates. And similar shifts have recently unfolded in many other places around the country. Okay, the last election law area I'll talk about is redistricting, the periodic redrawing of district lines. And I'll focus on how redistricting affects the major political parties. So the key trend that's relevant here is geographic polarization, changes in the voting patterns of different regions in America. Over the last few years, urban areas have become somewhat less democratic. They're still highly democratic, of course, but they're now 2 to 5 percentage points less democratic than they were in 2016, depending on which races we look at. On the other hand, suburbs have become 3 to 5 points more democratic over the last few years. They often used to have narrow Republican majorities, but now they typically have narrow Democratic majorities. And then rural areas have moved significantly in a Republican direction over the last decade. They've shifted by 6 to 8 points toward Republicans since 2012, and by a whopping 20 or so points since the mid-1990s. So this chart from Yair Gitza and Jonathan Robinson plots Democratic vote share versus population density for census tracts around the country for elections from 2008 to 2020. Now, it's a little hard to see, but if you look at the dark purple line, the darkest line on this chart, that's the line for the 2020 election. And it's lower than all the other lines for dense urban tracts where Democratic vote share has recently fallen. It's higher than all the other lines for suburban tracts where Democratic vote share has risen. And it's much lower than all the other lines for rural tracts where Democratic vote share has collapsed over the last decade or plus. So how are these geographic changes relevant to redistricting, which is my topic here? Well, since urban areas are now somewhat less democratic, urban districts are now likely to pack Democratic voters to a lesser extent than previously, i.e. Democratic candidates are now likely to win these districts by smaller, more efficient margins. Next, since suburbs are now majority Democratic, suburban districts are now more likely to crack Republican voters, i.e. Democratic candidates are now more likely to win suburban districts and by relatively narrow, more efficient margins. And then since rural areas are now much more Republican, rural districts are now likely to pack Republican voters to a greater extent, i.e. Republican candidates are now likely to win these districts by larger, less efficient margins. And notably, all of these recent shifts in the country's political geography benefit Democrats. Urban districts are becoming more efficient for Democrats. Suburban districts are flipping from red to blue. And rural districts are becoming less efficient for Republicans. And the consequence is that when districts are drawn without considering electoral data, for example, by a computer algorithm, maps are no longer consistently biased in Republicans' favor. Republicans had enjoyed an advantage for decades because their voters used to be distributed more efficiently. But that advantage is now much smaller and even non-existent in many places. So to illustrate, take this chart from a recent article by Nick Gettert et al. The authors use a computer algorithm to generate thousands of congressional maps for Texas. The partisan bias of these maps is on the y-axis, and their average compactness is on the x-axis. Now, if you look at the green triangles, those indicate maps that are generated without considering electoral data and prioritizing district compactness. their average partisan bias is close to 0, and most of the maps actually have negative scores indicating a Democratic edge. And so in Texas and in many other states as well, neutral party-blind redistricting now has a neutral or even a pro-democratic impact, which is very different from the historical case. So this development has subtle but quite important implications for partisan gerrymandering claims. These claims can no longer be brought in federal court because the Supreme Court held in 2019 that these kinds of claims are non-justiciable. Incidentally, that was in the case that I litigated against Kirkland and Ellis and lost. But these claims can still be asserted in many states where they typically require proof of partisan effect. So proof that a district plan disparately impacts the major parties. Importantly, there are two different ways of thinking about partisan effect, both of which show up in state court decisions all the time. One approach is to assess partisan effect relative to an arithmetical ideal of absolute neutrality. And there are several quantitative metrics that can be used for this assessment, all of which ignore a jurisdiction's political geography. They all ignore the spatial patterns of voters. The other approach is to assess partisan effect relative to many hypothetical maps that satisfy all nonpartisan criteria for a jurisdiction, but are generated without considering electoral data. And so this method fully does incorporate a jurisdiction's political geography into the benchmark that's then used for comparison. So in the past, these two ways of thinking about partisan effect sometimes conflicted, and this conflict hurt plaintiffs. So in a 2012 Florida case, for example, the court agreed that the challenged plan was biased according to arithmetical metrics, but the court still ruled against the plaintiffs because the court found that this bias was caused by Florida's then pro-Republican geography. Now, however, that more states have more neutral geographies, the two approaches to partisan effect usually converge. So in a state with a neutral geography like Texas, the benchmark based on arithmetical metrics is essentially the same as the benchmark based on counterfactual maps for the jurisdiction. And this convergence helps plaintiffs because it means that a plan now looks biased no matter how the degree of bias is assessed. So here's an example from an Ohio case from 2022. So looking arithmetically at how Republican seat share compares to Republican vote share in different plans, Ohio's congressional plan was extremely biased in Republicans' favor, more biased than almost all other congressional maps over the last couple decades. And crucially, the plan was also highly biased relative to thousands of computer-generated maps. It had more Republican districts than just about all of those comparator maps. And so the two ways of thinking about partisan effect converged in this case, and they've also converged in many other cases. And the reason they converged is precisely because Ohio's political geography has changed over the last few years and become more neutral than it was in the past. The country's changing political geography also has significant policy implications. So first off, it means that both parties can now gerrymander with comparable ease and effectiveness. Republican gerrymandering is no longer boosted by Republican voters' spatial patterns. And democratic gerrymandering is no longer an uphill struggle because of where Democratic voters happen to live. And the same symmetry applies to efforts to stop gerrymandering. So one anti-gerrymandering strategy is to impose a ceiling on the degree of permissible bias in district plans. This, for example, was the approach of a federal bill in 2022 that came 2 votes away from being adopted by the Senate. So this strategy now treats the parties symmetrically because, unlike in the past, their plans are now equally likely to exceed any particular bias threshold. So another common way to curb gerrymandering is by requiring nonpartisan actors, like independent commissions, to draw district lines. In the past, there was sometimes a concern that commissions might unintentionally design pro-Republican maps because of how voters are spatially distributed in many states. But now that the country's political geography is more neutral, commissions tend to adopt quite fair plans, even when they lack any particular instructions to do so. You can see the excellent record of today's commissions in this chart from Chris Warshaw et al. It shows you the partisan bias of today's congressional plans based on which institution designed them. And the average bias of today's commission-drawn plans is now very close to 0, unlike in other historical periods. This chart also makes the point that Democratic and Republican gerrymanders are now similar in their potency. So unlike in the past, Democratic gerrymanders now benefit Democrats to almost exactly the same extent, on average, as Republican gerrymanders benefit Republicans. So let me close by taking a step back and very briefly trying to evaluate the new electorate and the new world of election law and policy that it's producing. So tentatively, I think this is a better world than the one it's replacing. With respect to voting, it's a really positive development that low propensity voters are now politically diverse and not a predominantly Democratic or Republican group. This means that no party today has much electoral incentive to restrict voting. And going forward, it could mean that the parties will become more willing to adopt voting policies for nonpartisan reasons, since these policies no longer have significant partisan impacts. With respect to minority representation, almost everyone agrees that less racially polarized voting is desirable, and that's what we've witnessed to some extent over the last few elections. And while less racially polarized voting could undermine certain legal claims, it's unlikely to reduce overall minority representation, which is the goal that those claims are trying to achieve. And with respect to redistricting, lastly, it's terrific news that the country's political geography is now more neutral. This means that geography now puts less heavy a thumb on the scale of representation. And going forward, it could also mean that the parties will become more willing to reform redistricting and potentially end the practice of partisan gerrymandering, since neither party now has a clear geographic advantage in districting. So in this little graphic, you can see the hands as representing the new American electorate, and the globe as representing the new world of election law and policy that's emerging. So I think the hands are offering us a better world, and I think we should take that offer. Thank you. absolutely. Yeah.
So questions from the audience, don't be shy. There.
I think this is really fascinating.
We have a microphone. Sorry.
This is really fascinating and compelling. I would also add, if you think about money, one striking thing about super PAC money, for example, is it too has depolarized, and that the spending on both sides is basically equal now, and in 2020 it was more democratic. It might be more democratic this way too. But I wonder what the consequence of all these is for the clinic. It sounds like you're not going to have much work left anymore.
Yeah, Ruth may have thoughts of her own on this. So I think this new reality absolutely has not sunk in yet for politicians and interest groups and lawyers and activists. Everyone is still behaving as if voting restrictions benefit Republicans, voting expansions benefit Democrats. Republicans have an innate spatial advantage in redistricting. So I think it takes time for big shifts in the political environment to kind of seep into the consciousness of the parties. And I think we're not there now. So for at least the foreseeable future, I think we're likely to see a continuing stream of gerrymanders and voting restrictions and lots and lots of electoral litigation. Even if it's kind of pointless at this point, the pointlessness has not been absorbed by the relevant actors. So maybe if the YouTube of this talk spreads widely, maybe some states will pass fewer voting restrictions, and the parties can consider coming to agreement on some of these issues. I think Ileana had a question. Okay.
Do you want to ask? I believe it started with "this was boring."
I want to.
Followed by,
you,
what does
Ileana.
this mean for kids?
I think it's good news for kids, Ileana. Because I think it might mean that when you're all grown up and get to participate in elections, they might not be as hostile and mean as they are right now. There might be less division, more agreement, and it could be nice to be a voter in that kind of world.
Thank you for this talk. This was really interesting. I'm kind of curious about sort of the nonpartisan shift in voting restrictions. I get that that's at the nationwide level. Do we see any sort of differentiation on a state-by-state basis?
I don't think I know enough about how the data varies from state to state to really say. There are plenty of court cases where in particular states or other jurisdictions, the evidence has been consistent with this. That I mentioned Virginia's photo ID law not having a disparate partisan impact in that state, and there are other similar cases I can name out of Michigan and elsewhere. But the political science studies that I lean on are broader in their coverage. They're looking at how some policy generally affects the party's fortunes nationwide, and so they don't really zero in to what's going on in a particular state. So I have suspicions that the overall story is similar in many particular jurisdictions, but I don't have enough data to say conclusively if that's the case. And you could imagine the overall story being right, but there being a lot of heterogeneity around that standard story. And so maybe there still are really worrisome voting restrictions in some places. That may well be the case, but I don't really have the data to speak to that.
Really wonderful, fascinating talk. You talked several times about depolarization along certain lines and the sort of salutary effects that that's having. Of course, that sort of stands in contrast to what we hear all the time about partisan polarization and specifically negative partisanship driving so much political behavior. So I'm curious how you see these two realities interacting, and I'm wondering if you think that there are any implications for partisan polarization that this racial depolarization and income depolarization have. So I really like the idea that when I grew up, elections are going to be less nasty. And I'm curious sort of if you would just sort of say the next paragraph as relates to partisan polarization.
Yeah, so I think when people talk about partisan polarization, they mean a couple of things. They could mean affective polarization, so the degree to which Democratic and Republican voters dislike each other. They could also mean ideological polarization, so the extent to which Democratic elected officials are ideologically different from Republican elected officials, or to what extent the same ideological polarization holds in the electorate. So the trends I'm describing here don't have much connection to affective or ideological polarization. I'm solely looking at trends in polarization in voting without looking at anyone's attitudes toward co-partisans or people from the other party, and without looking at all at ideological cleavages. There's certainly no sign in recent data that affective or ideological polarization are declining. Cass Sunstein sometimes shows evidence about how people today, the one thing they really don't want their child to do is marry somebody from the opposite party. And the rates of opposition to cross-partisan marriage are massively higher today than circa 1970 or 1950 or something. And ideological polarization in legislatures has been increasing steadily since about 1980 and doesn't show any signs of reversing. So in other work, I've thought a lot about other forms of polarization. I haven't tried to connect those other forms to the forms that I address here, but my first pass is there isn't much of a connection yet. And so regrettably, financial depolarization, some racial depolarization in voting doesn't seem to be getting us any reduction in affective or ideological polarization.
Well, I hate to end on a less than happy note. I think we must. So I have one more task to do, which is the big surprise